What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video on how I view video games, so to speak, after 100+ video game reviews. I think the actual number is somewhere around 150, but truth be told, it's getting a little difficult to get the exact count at this point, but roughly somewhere between 130 and 150. That said, this video is not super scripted or anything. I got a comment actually suggesting a sort of video like this, and it sounded intriguing enough for me to move forward with it, but I don't have a bunch of notes in front of me or anything, so a little more off the cuff. But to sort of set the scene nonetheless, obviously that is a lot of game reviews, the vast majority of which were 100%, and when you're talking about games in that volume, especially when you are looking at them with a critical eye and then presenting them to the general public, so to speak, who you'll then have conversations about below said video, I think it's pretty obvious that the way you look at and approach these things is definitely going to change over time. Because for starters, I'm exposed to so many more viewpoints of games than I ever would have been otherwise, simply from interacting with people who watch my videos, which is kind of the first thing I want to talk about, because especially when you're reviewing games, you look at a lot of things that you in particular might not really care that much about because it doesn't affect you in one way or another. To give a very easy example of this, when it comes to field of view sliders in first-person games, that's not something that affects me at all. I know a lot of people need that slider to adjust it so they do not get motion sickness, and because I know that's an important feature for people, I will look for it, along with a host of other accessibility options, etc. And I'll usually make note of things like that, even if they do not affect me directly, or it's not something that is going to get in the way of my own enjoyment. So in some respects, with that being an easy example, I've definitely gotten to the point where I'm on the lookout for things that mean basically nothing to me personally, which then leads into a broader conversation around looking for things to criticize. Because while I think it's safe to say from my reviews and how I approach them that I don't go into games looking to hate them, at the end of the day I do this because I love doing it, but at the same time, after playing all of these games and knowing that I'm going to make a review for them, I often approach them with the mindset of what could make this experience better for not just me, but also other people at large. And that kind of mindset is usually how I approach judging the more negative aspects of a title, which leads me to my next point, which is that probably one of the biggest criticisms my own reviews get is that people wish I was more critical, or I would use more, let's say, directly negative language. And I would say all of that stuff I just talked about is usually the reason why I'm not. Because while it is certainly, in my opinion, easy to throw out things like, oh, this game sucks, this game is trash, etc., those statements are not helpful to essentially anyone, because they tend to be lacking in detail, frankly. It's easy to say something sucks, but what about it sucks? What specifically about that experience is not good for you? And to bring this back to the point of the video itself, that's one of the ways that how I look at games has changed, because again, I used to just be like, well, I don't like this game and that's that. But with reviews, I find it is helpful for everyone to be vastly more specific than that and talk about the minutia of why certain aspects of it just don't jive, which is all a very long-winded way of saying that I've become more critical in how I look at games, very obviously, but I try to approach that through the lens of how can I convey this in a way that is actionable, so to speak. And I talk about all of that because another thing that often comes up when I do these reviews, etc., is how much I actually enjoy playing games at this point. And as I mentioned earlier, I still very much so love it. I think getting to do this for a living now is an absolute dream. And while there is often conversation around turning the thing you love doing into a job, for me, the biggest change there is simply that I am much more critical and looking to make criticism about things where I typically just wouldn't have before, often about things that don't affect me directly, which can feel a bit bizarre at times. But moving on a little bit, I would say probably the other largest thing that's really changed in how I look at games since I started doing all this is actually the difficulty involved. Now, this is a much discussed topic across all sorts of genres and types, but one thing that I think is probably the only universal thing about difficulty is simply that what difficulty means to you is not what it means to someone else. What difficulty means to people people, as well as what they even consider difficult, is just going to vary so wildly from person to person. Now, for me, the way that has changed over the course of reviewing all of these games is simply that, honestly, I don't really see games as difficult at all anymore, because at this point, I've played so many and I've checked out so many systems that there are so many common threads through just all of them that the question isn't really, can I do something, versus how long is this going to take me to do? And as somebody who reviews, of course, primarily single-player RPGs, I think that ultimately makes a lot of sense, because what I'm overcoming are set encounters, set difficulties, set challenges, essentially, meaning that the bar is here and you have to find a way to clear it. Now, you apply something like difficulty to the concept of something that is multiplayer, and suddenly that's an entirely different ballgame. The difficulty of it becomes the skill level of your opponent. And for many people, that challenge kind of is the ultimate difficulty. But what hasn't changed for me in relation to video games really is that I don't really find a lot of enjoyment in multiplayer anything these days. In my early 20s, I really enjoyed it, MMOs, PvP, etc. But these days, the thought of sitting down and getting people to cooperate to overcome various challenges via video games honestly sounds exhausting, and I'd just rather not. But back in my own wheelhouse, single-player RPGs these days, I used to consider a lot of them difficult. I used to consider Tactician mode on DOS 2 very difficult. But one thing that reviewing all of these games has helped me understand is honestly just how to adapt to the various challenges therein. These days, if I fail at something in a game, I honestly just start with asking myself why, what specifically was the problem. How do I change my approach to this system? And while that's hard to quantify at a larger level, a lot of games have similar systems, and the more you're familiar with them, the easier it gets to track down the specific issue. And all of that has kind of led to me just not really seeing those games as difficult at all anymore. And again, it coming down to more just how much time am I going to have to spend at figuring this out, which these days has become a pretty efficient process. Because I've played so many games, you gain this sort of wealth of experience with not just the games, but also the engines that they're used on sometimes, and how games with those engines tend to behave, all of which is information that can kind of feed into how you approach something and how you can overcome it as well. But it is a little strange looking at things I used to consider very difficult and now being able to pinpoint exactly what I was doing wrong and apply that to future endeavors. But I would say most of that is the bulk of how I feel about games these days after reviewing so many titles, or at least the things that have changed, I should say, because what has remained the same is honestly my enjoyment of them. I still love playing video games. I love sharing that experience with other people. My own son is getting to a point where he can kind of understand video games himself a little more, and getting to see him light up while also getting to see his gears turning as he figures things out is a really great experience that reminds me of something I enjoy the most about these things, because while I don't always enjoy playing games with other people, they are nonetheless experiences that I love sharing with people, which I hope doesn't come as a surprise for a video game review channel. But one of the favorite things about this job for me is getting to talk about these games with so many people, which is all to highlight that in many ways, yes, after reviewing so many games and doing this for a living, it's absolutely changed a lot of things, but at the same time, there are things that have remained constant. But if I had to boil it down to one thing in particular, I would say the biggest thing for me in terms of all these game reviews is simply that while that sort of first-time magic of playing video games has long since came and went, I do still love playing them, and quite obviously, I love discussing them. And the enjoyment around these discussions and talking to people in the comments about said games has sort of come to occupy the space of that sense of wonder that inevitably has to fade away as you play more and more games and you understand what they are fundamentally, how they're built, etc. But without rambling on for too long, it's obviously been quite a long journey, with hopefully yet hundreds more reviews to come and many more discussions therein to be had. So with all of that said, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was at least interesting for you. I'd love to hear about how you feel about these things down in the comment section below. So of course, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.